I started out painting from a very early age. My dad is really creative, but he works with his hands, metal worker. And for me, making my art, I found it kind of a similar thing, but like it was different materials in some way. I was incredibly dyslexic when I was at school, and when I was drawing, it was one of the few lessons I really enjoyed. It was one of the few lessons I actually had anyone trying to copy me. I think you gravitate towards what makes you feel good when you're young and gives you a certain amount of confidence. I was taught by an artist called John Virtue, who taught underneath Frank Halbach. Frank Halbach was part of a group of artists which are kind of labelled the London School, and that also included Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon. So there's this very kind of visceral, figurative lineage between those artists. I look at other artists like Van Gogh, who are incredibly important, William de Kooning, and for me, these artists are really playing around with the same kind of ideas or the same language, and I think art is all about language. What I learned from the guys I've mentioned and I've been looking at is again relates to that painting from life, or looking at something which resonates and passing on that energy in a sense. I don't see them as portraits at all. I think when I paint, they're always painted from life in a mirror. I don't see them as me. I'm just trying to catch something very visceral, something which has life. I would say it has life on its own. It has to feel like it's an entity of some sort. It's not me or someone else, but it definitely has to resonate. With the raw intent work, it was always something I wanted to have a go at. It was always something I feel I was moving towards. But before, I didn't have the dexterity or the confidence to actually fulfill that idea. Sometimes with your work creatively, you come to crossroads. And then I felt like, I have to try this now, or like, when am I going to do it? And it felt like leap into a next phase. And then from there, it gave me a whole new creative, it was like a well of ideas which came from that. The great thing about looking at painters like Halbach and Freud, they always painted from life. And when you paint from life, you draw from life. When you draw, you can kind of carve into the paper. You can see around the head and follow it through. It's the same with painting. So I find painting from a photograph is totally fine if that's what you want to do. For me, it's all about what information can I get from that, which is why when I look in the mirror, I can turn my head and I can see where the light's falling. And so I find painting and sculpture really similar. Obviously, one is 2D and one is 3D, but you can get that essence of 3D. And like I said, carve into the canvas. And for me, it just adds to that resolution in a sense and makes things resonate for me, and it just gives it that feeling of life, which there are enough objects in the world, so I want to make something else which doesn't feel like an object. So when I start off making the paintings, I work on these backgrounds. I use poppy oils and various glazes. When I paint the figures, it's a very different way of painting. I use this mirror here. It fits perfectly in this room because it's quite thin, but I can see quite a lot. So when I'm painting myself, I'm just information. So I'm looking at where the light falls on my face. So I kind of feel like I'm just sort of, I'm the model, I'm like scaffolding, but it's not about me. I'm, like I said earlier, I'm really just trying to capture something which has, I don't know, an emotional value. So when I'm painting, these are just some of the brushes, but I can use brushes which are over a foot long. But when this is loaded with paint, they become incredibly thick and quite heavy and cumbersome. I use scraper tools like these as well, which are used for printing, but I load it up with paint too. And when you're scraping this along the body of the canvas, there's quite a lot of weight on that. So you have to be quite physical. The paint will fall down and it will hang off. And when it's doing that, there's this sweet spot. It's a bit like a train which is hurtling towards the end of the track. You can get the painting to 70% or 80% in your head where it's kind of working and firing on all cylinders. But if you could take it to 90% or even 95%, 98%, and you want to just stop everything just before you overwork it, because sometimes if you overwork it, it feels like that train is smashing into those barriers, and that's generally the point where you've overworked the painting and there's no way of rescuing it. You can't rewind any of those marks. That painting will never be the same, and that happens a lot. When I work on a piece, you'll generally go through 10 different bodies and heads, but you're trying to find that one piece which is really, it just sparks on all cylinders. It's a bit like throwing a jigsaw puzzle in the air where everything lands exactly in the right spot, and you're looking for that exact moment where everything comes together. I used to throw away, but it's quite expensive paint. So what I do now, I try and have canvases where I can load that onto. And if that will dry in a couple of months' time, that'll be a body or the backing for something else. So you're layering and you're layering. I try and use every piece of paint. I scrape paint off the walls and I reapply it into new painting. So everything, you know, goes through this kind of process where, you know, it's recycled in a sense. And I like that sense that like the studio is almost giving bits off to me. It's like, you know, it's like harvesting work. So when you're cleaning your brushes, when they're loaded with paint after a session, you're exhausted from a day's painting. Because like I said, it takes me weeks to do the backgrounds. It takes me a day to do the figure, because you can't come back to it because your palette will change. The marks will be different and bits of the painting might dry. So you've got to try and do it in one day. So after that, when you're exhausted from painting, you then look at the carnage you've left on the floor. Basically, you look at your brushes. And like I said, they're really expensive, so you want to clean them. But basically, you've got to, your cleaning fluids and all that, but you've got to wash them and wash them and wash the time again. It's another hour at least, another hour and a half. So it's just, yeah, it's a pain.